So I think we have quite a few of you on board. Thank you very much indeed for joining. And I'd very much like to welcome you to this In Conversation with Henry Dimbleby, which we have this afternoon for you. Henry, as you know, is a founder of Lyon, the fast food restaurant. I think he's very successfully managed to sell it on, so he doesn't have to worry about that anymore. But of course, he was asked by Michael Gove to look into a national food strategy, which he has reported on. I've got the national plan here before you. It's a very thick document. And the government very recently reported on his paper and came up with the government food strategy. And that's really what we're going to talk about this morning. You've got Henry's biography on the slides in front of you. And I'd like to start by asking Henry about the government's food strategy that came forward. Because although the government's recently published it, it's been heavily criticised by some. And given the breadth of your two reports, which were commissioned by Michael Gove, as I said, are you disappointed with what you've seen?
So thanks, Mark, for having me, and enormous thanks. So many members of your organisation have helped both during the writing of the report and helping get the message across. I think that actually this response is the government's third response to my work. There was a response last year when Marcus Rashford campaigned for some recommendations on dealing with food poverty, on Healthy Start vouchers, holiday food and activity programs and so forth, and the government put those in place. In the Levelling Up white paper earlier this year, they also said they were going to put in place recommendations on education and on trying to get communities, the food environment in communities better, community eat well, we called it. And this response was very much directed at the agricultural side, food production, agriculture and the environment. There was to be, and maybe we'll come on to this, a fourth response, which was going to be in the then Health Secretary Sajid Javid's Health Disparities white paper. And that was going to be published before the recess. Clearly, that's not going to happen now. And so there is a whole part of the strategy on health that won't have been dealt with sufficiently. But actually, I think that the government's response was very interesting in some areas, a bit disappointing in other areas. So where it was interesting, I think, and again, I'm sure we'll discuss this, was actually head on saying that we needed to think more carefully about how we use our land, how we use land not just to produce food, but energy, sequester carbon, restore biodiversity, build, and a recognition of the fact that government departments couldn't incent and regulate independently. There needed to be some kind of framework on that, and that has been already criticised from all sorts of different angles, but it's fundamentally important. You can't do anything that you need to do unless you do that. So I think that was fantastic. There was some good stuff in there on data and trying to get more data out from the system publicly available. And there was some good stuff on innovation and some hints that they might do some interesting things on procurement. The one area of disappointment was trade. So in the Tories' election manifesto, they said that trade deals wouldn't compromise British production standards. So effectively that you wouldn't set high standards in this country and then allow people to import food raised at lower standards, thereby undercutting British farmers and exporting those harms abroad. And what was interesting was in the, there was a leaked version of the white paper that came out before the weekend, when the final version was published, and there was much stronger wording in that on trade, which actually took my recommendations and said that they would think about doing dual tariffs. So if Brazil or America produce food to lower standards, you'd effectively put a much higher tariff on that and therefore not be undercut. That disappeared by the final version. So I would say, I think that generally the DEFRA approach is going in the right direction. Clearly, there are many ways in which it could go wrong in the rollout. We've only seen so much in terms of what the Future Farming Programme will how that will be implemented. But so far, I think so good. And the National Land Use Framework is going to be a huge, very politically sensitive part of the equation. They're going to publish that next.
Well, Henry, we'll come on to that in a second. And what I should have said right at the outset to those of you who are listening is right at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. And as we have our discussion, do please enter any questions you'd like to ask of Henry so we can build them up. And the plan of this morning and straight this afternoon is that Henry and I will have a discussion for about half an hour, and we'll aim to give all of you who are watching about half an hour to have your questions discussed and answered. Bring it to a close at about 1:45. That's the sort of overall plan. But just to dig into part of what you said, if I may, on the dietary issues and on the health issues. Now, quite rightly, you say, well, there should have been alongside this a health strategy going alongside this overall food strategy. And I did talk to Victoria Prentice about it, and she said, oh, well, of course, that's for the Department of Health. They're going to bring that out. Now, we're in this no man's land at the moment where we're having to wait for a new leader of the Conservative Party, a new Prime Minister, and we won't really know very much until the 5th of September. With the work that you've done on your own report and by reviewing the government strategy, and also in your role sitting as a lead non-executive on DEFRA, what's happening behind the scenes in the Department of Health in coming up with a health strategy paper to address so many of the recommendations that you made in your second report?
So, as you may know, they brought the public health back into the department, and they set up the Office for Health Disparities, which is headed by Chris Whitty. And specifically, there is a group of civil servants working on how we think about dealing with the fact that people in the poorest 10% of postcodes live on average 7 years less long than those in the richest, and that they're actually dying earlier. Life expectancy in those groups is going down, and a large the biggest contributory factor, avoidable contributory factor, that is diet. And I understand that they were looking pretty seriously at diet. I had argued that what I call the junk food cycle, that there was this reinforcing feedback loop between our evolved appetite, which makes us eat food that is, love food that is high in calories, high in fat and sugar and salt. And actually, if it's low in fiber, it makes us full less quickly. And that the commercial incentives of companies had meant that they'd spent more on marketing that stuff, we'd eaten more, they'd spent more, and we'd got sick. And that you needed quite strong intervention in those commercial incentives. Companies couldn't do it on their own. All the CEOs of the companies will tell you that they can't do it on their own privately, that they need more regulation. But it is a very, very difficult, particularly for the Tory party, political area, because obviously it goes against libertarianism. They worry about the nanny state. And what I understand is Sajid Javid, who is, ideologically small state, doesn't, ideologically not interventionist, having seen what was going on in the health service, had become convinced that something needed to be done, that actually needed to be intervention, and was working on something in that area. But obviously that work will now be shelved. You'll have, you've got three electorates that the government, the next prime minister is in sequence going to be trying to attract. First of all, he or she has got to attract MPs of the party. Then they have to get a bit more right wing to appeal to the members, and then they've got to appeal to the electorate. The next health secretary will see exactly what Sajid Javid did, that the numbers are horrific, and it's going to, even just from a cost point of view, regardless of the human misery, it's going to overwhelm the health service. But I guess it's going to be kicked a year down the post, 6 months down the line, who knows?
So, I mean, it's something that George Eustace raised at the Devon show when I went down there and spoke with him to members that morning. And he said that actually, as a government, we're not going to tell people what to eat.
Yes.
But actually, there's the rub in that we probably, as a society, should, because if we don't guide people in the right direction, then you end up with a huge, great burden on the health service. So funny enough, in that same week, on that Monday, when the food strategy came out, there was also a report that came out by the Sustainable Food Trust, a rather radical, came up with a lot of extreme measures. And also there was, of course, a food strategy that came out from the Scottish government. So there is the rub between the two. Do we live in a free market, which we do? Farmers are there producing food that's most appropriate for their land. The food is the base of what they're going to eat within their diet. But at what stage does somebody, somewhere along the line, sit back? Maybe it's through better education, maybe it's through better knowledge, to say, actually, the mix of the ingredients ends up resulting in a very unhealthy diet.
Yeah, and I think that Andrew Marr, the political TV journalist, who used to be known as Red Andy. He used to be kind of very left wing, and he wrote a very interesting thing about the free market. He said, he'd come to realise how powerful the free market was, how completely impossible it was to plan the economy, but that therefore governments should be responsible for doing two things, which is the free market creates dirt in the form of pollution, externalities, and it exacerbates inequality. And the job of government should be to clean up the dirt and to try and find ways of making society more equal. When it comes to the question of what people eat, we did a lot of work with Isaac Levido, who is the kind of election guru for the Tories, to try and understand what people really were, the electorate wanted, because there's no point in arguing, for example, Patrick and the Sustainable Food Trust thing says, I think we need to have a 50% reduction in pork and a 50% reduction in chicken. The question is, how do you actually do that? What policies do you put in place? And funnily enough, on the health side, people are fed up. So they reckoned that you could actually get away with even a sugar tax, quite a strong fiscal intervention, and people realised that their children were bombarded with sugar. They didn't like it. They wanted to do something about it. What George, I think, normally in this context, George Eustace normally talks about is meat. And here the public appetite for government intervention is much, much lower than on health. So when we would talk to people about potential interventions to help to make people eat less meat, people would get very, very prickly, or a strong minority would get very prickly quite quickly. And so we actually said, you need to, and you can intervene on health quite strongly. You won't get thrown out as a political party. If you intervene in certain ways on meat, you probably would, put it in a meat tax, which would be extremely regressive, because mince would be taxed as a proportion of its cost much higher than fillet steak. I think you'd be out of power within days, if not weeks. It would really cause big electoral problems. So what do you do about it? And we said, well, you do need to reduce meat, probably by about 30%, but you could probably do that through a combination of the market introducing alternative proteins, pushing vegetarian food, because unlike the junk, the health stuff, it's no skin off the supermarket's nose whether they sell meat or vegetables. They can make money from both, whereas on the health side, they make more money if they sell the bad stuff. So we reckon that with a gentle shift from supermarkets using methane suppression innovation in ruminants and alternative proteins, you probably can get the reduction in meat and avoid George or any politician having to be, which they really fear, having to intervene in that area. So I think it depends. I think telling people what to eat, like people, you just have to be quite careful about your tone, about how you go about it.
Yeah, no, I agree, very much agree on that. Can I just turn now to food production itself? And what do you think the government needs to do to ensure food production receives the recognition it deserves? How can it be done through, if you like, the right price through the market? And then how, going back to what you were commenting on earlier, does it relate to imports coming from countries producing food to lower standards?
So, food security is one of the top concerns of any government. From ancient Athens, which I think was the first major society to import almost half of its food from the north of the Black Sea. And obviously in this country, since the war, before the war, we grew about 30% of our own food. We now grow about 65% of our own food, and we're quite rich. So we are not facing the problems that Egypt or other countries which have developed populations, thanks to food transport, that far exceed their ability to produce that food. But what a government in this country should be seeking to do is to, and the government actually said they want to maintain, they think the current level is about right. We went through subsidies to produce too much food in the 80s, and most people on this call probably remember the butter mountains and the wine lakes and the problems that caused. So the government has said in this white paper, we're probably about the right level. What we now want to see is kind of diversity and resilience in that. So I think that the critical thing for the government as it goes through the future farming program is thinking about, first of all, which land is best used for energy production, food production, biodiversity restoration, carbon sequestration. And when people say, you can't eat butterflies, biodiversity is this. If we don't preserve our biodiversity, Patrick Vallance was writing about this in the paper the other day, we are dead as a species. So you can't eat butterflies, but they're incredibly important to us. So the government needs to work out with its food strategy where in the country we should be doing those different things, and then create the incentives and the regulations so that land users like yourself are incentivized to do the right things rather than the wrong things. Now, it is incredibly complicated, obviously. In Devon, where there's a bit of work thinking about how you look at a land use framework, and it's my part of the world, but I'm not in London. We have, you get money from DEFRA, from RPA, from EA, from NE, from BAYS, from the LEPs, DLUC in planning, DCMS, and then we also have unitary authorities, lower tier councils, we have protected landscapes, areas of natural beauty, natural nature reserves, SSSIs. It's very complicated how you think about, once you've got the vision, how that actually gets implemented. But we can't pretend that you need the vision. Yes, it's complicated. You need to think about where we're going as a country with our land use. And I think broadly, very crassly speaking, we have to accept the fact that we want to continue to produce land, food at high yields in the east, ideally with lower inputs, lower carbon footprint, but still releasing some carbon, and that we need to be sequestering more carbon and restoring biodiversity a bit more in the west while producing food, and in the uplands. That's a very crass version, but those are the kinds of things as a nation we need to be discussing at groundswell. You know, there was a farmer who was saying, you know, who farms on very fertile peat in, I can't remember whether it was Norfolk or Suffolk, and he was saying, you know, what am I meant to do? I'm being told I need to restore wildlife. I've got this peat that's releasing carbon, but I produce a lot of food, and he needs to have at a high conceptual level an answer to that question. I've given kind of broadly what I think my answer would be for him, which is carry on producing food. We'll need to sequester some of that carbon elsewhere, but there may be areas of your land that are lower yielding, which you could look at restoring nature, etc. But he needs that answer. And then all of those different authorities, once you've got that answer, need to think about how we incentivize land use. It's not going to be a strategy. It's not going to be a Stalinist plan, but we need to make sure the incentives make sense so that we have robust, profitable landowners who are doing the things that make them money and are what we as a country need.
Yeah. So just following on from that, this issue of land use framework and creating this balance between food production, climate action, environmental standards, and then you had your phrase that I've had quoted back to me as well, you can't eat butterflies, which perhaps just misunderstands the situation. And you've talked about a 3-compartment model. Where do you think that farmers can play their part, and how is it going to link in with the House of Lords Select Committee that's looking at this as well?
So I think it is worth just saying why butterflies, why biodiversity, digging into that is important in a bit more detail. So the American biologist E.O. Wilson, The Diversity of Life, sets out a kind of number of utilitarian reasons why we want to preserve biodiversity. He starts talking about the rosy periwinkle in Madagascar, which is a pretty little herbaceous flower that was found in the 50s to produce 2 alkaloids that cure most victims of 2 cancers, Hodgkin's disease, which mostly affects young adults, and acute lymphatic leukemia, which used to be a death sentence for children. In fact, my cousin was cured by the medicine of lymphatic lymphocytic leukemia. And by the early 90s, the income from the manufacture and sale of those medicines was about 180 million worldwide. 40% of today's medicines are extracted from plants, microorganisms or animals. And yet 99% of all the species that ever lived are extinct. So there's a rich diversity of unknown benefits. And on top of that, as Patrick Vallance pointed out, these, in The Guardian early on this week, these ecosystems offer us services in terms of cleaning water, pollinating plants, so on and so forth. And if you denude them, they are more likely to collapse. So butterflies, although you can't eat them, we cannot survive without biodiversity. So then the question is, how do you preserve that? And the 3-compartment model that we set out noted that actually there are different forms of wildlife that exist and thrive in different habitats. We have had a farm landscape for a long time in this country, and therefore we have a lot of wildlife that has evolved to live on a farm. The dung beetle, for example, would have a pretty tricky time if you stopped farming ruminants. But there are whole ecosystems that live on farms. And at the same time, there are ecosystems that live better off farms. And so what you need is, it's actually more of a continuum than a 3-compartment model. But at one end, you'll have land which doesn't produce any food, which is restored to semi-wild uses. And at the other end, you'll have land that continues to produce a lot of food more sustainably with lower inputs, lower carbon footprint, but with less wildlife living on that farm. And then in the middle, you'll have kind of agroecological, lower yielding farms with a lot of wildlife on them, where the land is shared with the wildlife. And it's not one or the other. You'll have a range of these things. And the land use framework will need to work out, broadly speaking, how much of each of those we need. And interesting, I think we will see, I heard that there's a framework about to be published by one of the nature charities that's going to say, well, actually, we thought that about 5% of our farmland would be returned, found much lower capacity, but that would still mean 53% of our land would be pasture. It wasn't a great thing. They're arguing that actually we need to take more land out of farming. 20% of our farmland gives 3% of our calories, so that's probably possible. So I think we will then have these debates leading up to the government's thing, and also the science will change. So it's not like you're going to publish kind of one great tome that George Eustace is going to come, or whoever it is going to come down out of DEFRA with a block of stone saying this is our framework. It's more about being honest on an ongoing basis about what the country's priorities are and what we need our land to produce to use them. I think there are two areas that we haven't discussed where there's going to be huge debate. One is, we talked about this beforehand, fuel. Our biodigesters are sunk cost. Is that have we incentivized farmers to pursue that route and build a whole load of infrastructure that actually solar is going to be better to replace, which is would be a major headache. And the other is grade 1 land and housing and building, and how we think about, down here near me in London, in Kent, and in Sussex, there are endless campaigns on an individual basis about whether grade 1 land should be used to build houses. So I think, it's complex, but it's needed.
Yeah, no, and as you say, we're a smallish island. We've got food production, land for carbon sequestration, forestry, reversing the decline in biodiversity, production of renewable energy, and housing, as you say. It's going to be tricky to get the balance right. And I think, as you say, it's not going to be a government diktat. It's just going to end up being probably a complex equation that no doubt we'll all have views on, and it's something that will need to come through local government plus views for members who own land plus government.
I mean, interestingly, the housing one is the one, I think, which is a bit of a MacGuffin. It's a bit of a red herring. So 6% of England, less of the UK, is currently built on. And of that, buildings, rather than roads or pavements or whatever, only cover 2 or 3%. The problem there is, if there is a problem, is actually, which I think there is, certainly in parts of the south, I'm less familiar with the situation up north, is the amount of land that is under contract pending planning. So, I talk to horticulturists who are constantly wanting to put in place glass houses and can't, because huge swathes of land for not very much money being paid, well, good money to the people who own the land, but in terms of the amount of money they'd get if they got permission for the builders, it's nothing. And it's that, I think, is a real problem.
So I'd like to turn towards the end of this part of the conversation before we go to members' questions, just to think about supply chains and markets. Henry, do you believe there's a serious problem with the way the supply chain markets and also promotes food to the public?
So during COVID, we got to look at the supply chain for the first time pretty closely. So we had discussions in DEFRA early 2020 about whether we could feed the nation, whether we knew that. And on March the 23rd, we were told to stay at home. And what happened then, two things happened. 25% of the calories that we ate out of home were suddenly needed to be bought from shops. And then people moved away from supermarkets towards corner shops. So you had this huge dislocation. And DEFRA set up FRIF, which was the Food Resilience Industry Forum. We had regular morning calls. And it was pretty extraordinary how resilient the system was. The combination of the companies that supply our food with competition law suspended so they could talk to each other, managed to keep the nation fed in a pretty impressive way. And actually, I think it shows that while we do need a bit more cognizance of things like carbon dioxide and fertilizer potentially, actually the just-in-time system is more robust than many people thought it would be pre-pandemic. I think globally, the bigger problem that you've got is what we're seeing now. The biggest issue is, as I said before, the efficiency of transporting food and producing it cheaply in some parts of the world and transporting it to other parts of the world has meant that you have very large populations now living in places like North Africa and the Middle East, where the land simply couldn't support them. And they also happen to be not very affluent populations on average. And so that for me is the biggest problem with supply chains, which is it's going to get pretty hairy geopolitically for North Africa and the Middle East, I think, over the next 12 months. And there may well be food shortages, there may well be political instability. In the UK, I think we're lucky enough and rich enough to, I think the government wanting to produce more horticulture, the climate change is probably going to make us more productive. It'll be warmer, more CO2 in the air. So I think it's more about just being a bit careful, thinking about resilience, and that's time. Like, how much time do we need to have a bit more redundancy in the system, slightly higher capacity in certain areas, have certain chemicals, water cleaning chemicals and so forth onshore. But I don't think that we in the UK, that the supply chain's causing us major problems. In terms of the health, the commercial incentive of companies an absolute disaster, but in terms of the number of calories and the ability to move calories and nutrients to get them to the British population, I don't think we have nearly as big a problem as they do in some other parts of the world.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to run through some member questions now. And the first one that came in early on, and you have to scroll back some of the things we were talking about earlier. Sebastian Anstruther asked the question, he put the first part in quotes, telling people what to eat is a public health issue like air pollution, seatbelts and smoking. Progress was made on these issues through public lobbying pressure and legal challenge, but it took 20 years. Is this how we will make progress on healthy eating?
Yes, and actually smoking, I think, is the best analogy. Although you don't have to smoke, smoking is effectively another example of the commercial incentives of companies. I think that companies are as stuck in what I call the junk food cycle as people are, meaning that they were marketing highly addictive substances at us and making a lot of money out of it. And I don't think, while education is important for a number of other things, I don't think we can't educate our way out of this. It's not about education and willpower. It is going to require increasing legislative restriction. I wish it didn't myself. I personally hate having to argue for these kind of interventions, but I can't see any other way of doing it. But I think it is going to be through government intervention in the end that we solve the health problems. I actually think, interestingly, there are two sides to the junk food cycle. There is the appetite that we've evolved, which isn't suited to the environment, and there's the commercial incentives of companies that create the environment. I think that on the appetite side, and a lot of people think this is very dystopian, and I'll make, take your own. I think there will be increasing drug approaches to help people who struggle with appetite. So I think you will find us an increasingly medicalized population to prevent us from eating too much.
So I've got a question from Mark Preston. Do you think it's now inevitable that British consumers need to accept they'll spend a higher proportion of their disposable income on food that they've become used to in recent years, thanks to supermarket wars? So it's 8% against 15% in most European countries. And if so, what are the consequences for policy and consumer behaviour?
So it's a really, really interesting question. If you think about what a good diet might look like and well-produced food, people often say, well, look, it's organic and therefore it's going to be much more expensive, and that is sustainable. We did some work on this. We did some kind of modeling. And I actually think if we focus human ingenuity on creating a sustainable food system, for most raw ingredients, we do not think that there is any a priori reason why they have to be more expensive. The one, if you include animal welfare in that, and carbon, meat is the one example where it was difficult to see how the price wouldn't go up. So I think to Mark's question, what you're likely to see as we make this shift is ideally you'd have the prices for those in the bottom 10% affluent in the country wouldn't go up very much, although there would be a shift towards veggie burgers. 50% of people in Burger King in the US who buy their vegetarian burgers also buy meat occasionally. So I think ideally there is a shift that doesn't mean that, it's 8% for the richest people. For the poorest 5%, after housing, it can be over 50% of disposable income, and that would not be great, and I don't think it is necessary. But that is, there's a lot to pack in there. Who knows how the system will evolve? But we haven't been trying to make this stuff. We haven't been innovating nearly enough on how to create sustainable food, and our view was it didn't necessarily need to be hugely more expensive.
Thanks. And Annie Brown comes in with a specific question on your views, Henry, on the recent debacle between Tesco and Kraft/Heinz. Tesco seems to have come out as the good guys for defending the consumer in resisting price rises. At what stage will folk realise that as input prices rise, this cost has got to be passed on as a higher price for food on the shelf? Whether that price will be passed back to the primary producer is, of course, another matter.
Yes, so there are quite a lot of things to unpack in that question.
Yeah.
So, first of all, it's just fascinating seeing two huge organisations go head to head like that on negotiation. In the UK context, clearly we are much less, in terms of the primary producers, much less cooperatised than farming in most European countries. We dug into a bit of that, reasons why that was, but I do think that it would be good to have more cooperation between farmers in this country and more joint negotiating power. I think that farmers are picked off by the supermarkets just because of the imbalance in scale. In terms of passing the price on, clearly it is inevitable. The supermarkets work on very high volumes and low margins, typically between 1% and 3%. and so you simply can't. They can't wear a 5, 6, 7% price rise. What I do think they have been doing really well, actually, the supermarkets during this phase, is they've been taking the hit on the value ranges. So they have shown a responsibility for their least affluent customers, and most of the supermarkets are actually now, breaking even / making a small loss on some of that value thing and putting the inflation through on the items that richer customers purchase. Which is, I think that it's interesting. Our supermarkets now are split between, we've got 2 owned by private equity and the rest are still publicly owned. And you're beginning to see a little bit of divergence in behaviour, I sense, on that. So, for example, the private Morrisons are private equity owned, whereas Tesco and Sainsbury's both said they wouldn't be doing buy one, get one free on unhealthy products when the government suspended that. Morrisons said we will. And I think, if you have a private equity player owning a company with a shorter term time span, you might see slightly less responsible behaviour.
So, Henry, do you think that the government's got a policy on cheap food? And if it does, do you think the policy is now redundant?
But I think it is difficult. So I think for the government to have a policy on cheap food, I think you can't. Some people say, well, why don't you take money off tax bad food and subsidize vegetables? But subsidizing vegetables for me or you is insane. It's a terrible use of taxpayers' money, and so I think that what you're seeing now is 2 things going on. There is increasing disquiet over the amount of inequality in society generally. Food is simply food poverty is simply poverty. It just happens that people will skip meals before they'll avoid paying for their housing, for example, or they'll skip meals themselves before they take meals away from their kids. And that is incredibly complicated, beyond my pay grade. People are realizing it's happening, and worldwide people are trying to work it out. But it is increasingly accepted that for those who are really struggling, that benefits in kind are actually useful. So free school meals, healthy start vouchers, the holiday activity and food programs. The one thing I think the government could do more of, and I hope they're looking at, is those benefits now with inflation, not only have the amount of money food people can buy with the money that's stayed the same. Free school meals have been £2.30 for years, but also more people have been inflated into a situation where they need that. So I hope the government will be looking, they've said they are looking at revising those thresholds.
Now, I'm going to take 2 questions together because they relate to land use, although they are directed slightly differently. The first is from Alice Lampard. She says, I'm curious, you separate the land into areas of production, east, and environmental diversity, west. What might be the losses benefits of your suggestion? So I'm wondering about how the land managers at Holcombe would respond with their awareness of the multiplying factor of edges for biodiversity within agricultural productive land. And then the second question is from Andrew Davey, who says, I completely support your suggested need for the strategic designation of different parts of the national land resource to be focused on delivery of different essential elements for our existence, such as biodiversity, food production. How optimistic, pessimistic are you that the opportunity provided by the introduction of the ELMS scheme will help steer us in this direction?
So on the first one, clearly what I said was a crass generalization. So if you look at what Jake Fines is doing at Holcombe, on the Holcombe estate, there are benefits not only to biodiversity and nature there, but actually also in terms of natural pest reduction, etc. So it is not simply, what I'm suggesting is not the classic land sharing versus land sparing. It is a bit more of a continuum, and there will definitely be areas and ways in which farms in East Anglia can be managed for more biodiversity. On the second question, I don't know how optimistic and pessimistic I am. I kind of flit between various scenarios. The pessimistic scenario that I have is that the government, and I don't think George Eustace, I think he understands it, but that they lose the argument across government on basic payments. The basic payment system, the kind of repeal of that gets delayed. We therefore fail to show the benefits of the public money for public good. And the Treasury starts to take away the 3.4 billion of common agricultural policy money after the next election. And you get neither the benefits to nature nor the payments to farmers. And I really worry that the NFU's approach is like, be careful what you wish for. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to come to this forum, is just to, to reinforce how important it is that we seriously consider biodiversity and carbon as valuable things that our land can produce, carbon sequestration, and B, that we're quite careful about how we lobby government in terms of delaying the schemes. My optimism is that just so many farmers now that you meet up and down the country are beginning to realize that they want to farm in another way. Sometimes because they're interested in the biodiversity and the nature, and they want to make their farms kind of move in that direction. Others because they realize how risky the huge fixed costs of the inputs they're buying and putting on their business. And you see people all over the country doing it. The government's seen the benefit, and so there should be a route through. And I genuinely, it all depends now on it. George Eustace really gets it. He understands it better than anyone else in DEFRA, pretty much. He's been there longer than anyone else in DEFRA. And I think we're definitely going in the right direction, but we're in a very politically volatile time, so who knows?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Gavin Lane has asked, the Dutch government seems to have lost its temper with its farmers, and the lack of movement on diffuse pollution from livestock, and is potentially putting farmers in certain regions out of business. In the 3-compartment model, who pays for the external costs of those producing food on the Grade 1 land? Are these costs shared within society, paid for by the consumer, or paid for by the farmer?
So the theoretical answer, and Charles, I hope, would agree with me here, because the economist's answer would be that the latter two are the same. In the end, the consumer pays, the farmer pays, the consumer pays, and the polluter should pay. So, if I buy a chicken from a farm that is dumping that effluent into a chalk stream, I should pay through the farmer to clear up that chalk stream. That is absolutely, has to be the case. That should not be shared with society. Society should be paying for public goods, but not for private goods. How you make that transition is what is critical. So if we had, for example, on energy, just built in the carbon cost into petrol, fossil fuels 20 years ago, society would have been torn apart. What governments have done is they've massively incentivized alternative forms of production, and we're now at a stage where solar power, wind are becoming much cheaper. Obviously, there are times when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, and then you can begin to incorporate those external costs into the price of food. So you try to create a transition where you don't have the Dutch government losing temperature as farmers and putting them out of business. That's the ideal, but it's a very, very difficult as we see with the energy transition, the Gilets jaunes in France, and it's a difficult line to tread, but that is theoretically the correct thing to do.
No, that's very helpful. Well, look, in the last 10 minutes or so, I've got a couple more questions for you. Alex E has asked, at the start, you referred to the absence of trade protection for British farmers in the face of competition from lower standard of food production in, say, Australia and USA. What are the long-term implications of this for UK farmers?
Well, the answer to that is it depends what happens next. So the deals with Australia and New Zealand reflected the current trade flows. So the government didn't do no tariff, for example, on pigs and chicken, where they thought there would have been significant impact to our markets. But on beef and lamb, where most of that goes to the Middle East, and from Australia and New Zealand to the Middle East and to China and America, they had zero tariff. And so what they calculated was, even though theoretically they were allowing that food into the country and to undercut British food, it actually wouldn't come in because it would go elsewhere. Obviously, if China suddenly decides, for whatever reason, it wants to have a trade deal with Australia and New Zealand, we'll have to react pretty quickly because we will become the dumping point for those goods. But assuming that doesn't happen, there will be a kind of uneasy status quo. It'll be okay for UK farmers. They'll get opportunities to export cheese, etc., to Australia and New Zealand. The question is, what happens with Mercosur and Brazil and the US? So if we did the same deal with Brazil, Mercosur, that we did with Australia and New Zealand, undeniably, it would be, you would get food that had been, beef, for example, that had been reared to, with carbon of 45, 50 kilos per kilo, undercutting beef in the UK that had 25 kilos per kilo. You'd have beef that was being reared on recently deforested areas, and you'd be exporting huge environmental harms and putting large numbers of UK farmers out of business at the same time. And so the long-term implications all depend, A, on whether China decides to have a trade war with Australia or New Zealand, and B, on what the deals the government does with Mercosur and the US. On those last two, I'm a bit more optimistic than I was, because I think the government felt it really needed to get those trade deals done to prove that Brexit worked with Australia and New Zealand, and there isn't the pressure with Mercosur and the US, and within the system now, people are pretty cognizant of the problems that those deals would cause if done in the same way. So I think it's not a stable situation, but it's not necessarily a disastrous one.
Do you think that there may be the introduction of what Dieter Helm was proposing, which is a carbon border tax, which could address some of those issues that you comment on with regard to beef from, say, Brazil?
Yes, I think either that or a higher tariff. So George Eustace has actually raised that already publicly. And I think that is the way. It's either a carbon border tax or a higher tariff. But I think definitely that is the way that you make that happen. And it's it isn't hard to do. So, for example, organic milk farmers in this country who export their milk to the States have to get certified because they're lower tolerance to antibiotic use and so forth. So when they're sending milk fat to the States, they get accredited for the States. And there is no reason why you couldn't run similar accreditation systems with Brazil, so that meat that was reared sustainably in Brazil could compete, but meat that wasn't couldn't.
Thank you. So I'm going to take one last question from John Marland. With biodiversity net gain and mitigation in mind, can the private sector, and he's put in brackets developers, replace the loss of 3.7 billion of EU subsidies perhaps that's 3.4 e.g. BPS, and can the 50% of the farming community in the tenanted sector access these funds?
That is a good and complicated question. So I think there are all sorts of, so ideally, yes, and these are things that as the schemes are being developed, are being thought of very carefully. The biggest risk there for me actually is green finance. So at the moment, as you know, it's a bit of a wild west out there. People are selling their carbon 3 times on their farm. I worry that the government will come in and effectively force out private money in that area. But I see no reason why you couldn't combine private sector and look after tenant farmers if you've got the systems right. But the regulation on green finance is but well behind where it needs to be, simply because it's grown so fast. And so far, you know, we haven't seen how for landscape scale recovery and local nature recovery that will work for tenant farmers, and whether they'll be able to access those and whether they'll be shut out of them by their landlords.
Well, it's an area that Lord Benyon is looking at, and I know he's looking at how green finance will work within the private sector. But as we started off the discussion, you know, we don't really know how the political scene will look until we get to after September the 5th. So, Henry, I very much hope that the health strategy comes out to match up with the government's food strategy. And I very much hope that so many of your recommendations that have come through in those excellent reports that you've done do get looked at, particularly on trade with other countries. So, Henry, I think it only leaves me really to say huge thanks to you for coming along to speak to the members this afternoon. And I don't know whether you've got any closing thoughts that you'd like to share.
No, I only to say that the CLA's members have been, in general, extremely open, progressive, thoughtful about these issues, and that I know their voice is heard in government. So, you know, continue to lean in, because government is not going to be able to make this transition carefully if everyone is shouting at them. rather than be able to think they can tell the difference between genuine concerns and just reaction to change. I think the CLA has an absolutely enormous role to play in guiding us through that transition.
And presumably, Henry, you continue on in your lead role as a non-executive director at DEFRA.
I have my second term ends in early 2014, but I slipped gracefully into the background now that my policy work has been done. So you'll be hearing increasingly less of me, probably.
I think we need to hear more. Henry, thank you very much indeed. And thank you so much, everybody who's tuned in to join our In Conversation With webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.